to the third and last presentation in this series that we've called Emerging Pieces in the COVID-19 Puzzle, with myself, Rob Thomas, as your host, in conversation with Dr. Christine Horton. Christine's a nutritional biochemist and an educator in the science of nutrigenomics. Now, this is brought to you by Christine's company called CellLogic, and it's the professional education division that's sponsoring this, which is answering and reviewing some of the puzzling questions surrounding COVID-19. Now, in this final episode, we're going to tie together the first two episodes and look at some practical solutions that we can all implement. So welcome, Christine. And before I hand over to you, for anyone that missed episode 1 and 2, you can go to the CellLogic website at celllogic.com.au and into the Learning Centre and the audio and video learning, and you will find those there. So enjoy those. Welcome, Christine.
Thanks very much, Robert. Nice to be with you again.
Yeah, so Christine, look, this is a very complex situation, and you know, you've been through a lot of this already. So can you just review really briefly some of the enormous complexities surrounding, you know, what we call the immune defense systems and the cellular defense systems, which work, you know, hand in hand in the body?
Okay, so a very brief roundup from what we've done in the past. The important thing that we're trying to achieve in this video series is to explain how these wonderful inbuilt mechanisms within human cells are perfectly capable of dealing with a whole host of different infectious organisms. So we're not trying to kill the virus, but we are trying to give Mother Nature the tools she needs to do that job herself. So of those inbuilt tools that are in every one of our immune cells and a number of our other cells is, first of all, we have to actually detect that there's some sort of a threat there. Then we have to identify that that threat is actually a virus and not a parasite or a bacterium, for example. Then we mount an attack, and it's usually an attack that's based on producing enormous numbers of highly inflammatory cells. And then the most important step of all in the fine-tuning is that we have to know when to shut that attack down. That is very, very important part of the process, because when you hear about cytokine storms that get out of control and create enormous amounts of tissue damage, a lot of that is because the signal has not been present to shut down this attack.
So, Christine, and when you refer to Mother Nature, you're talking about not necessarily herbs or so on, but these beautiful mechanisms that are within the body and designed to deal with these. You know, there's incredible engineering at such a complex level.
It is.
So can you give us some, you know, outline some of those specific mechanisms that exist, particularly, you know, in the lung and within the gut?
Yes, so we covered this last time in a little bit more detail than I'm going to now, but essentially we've got here the respiratory epithelial cells. So they're the ones in the lungs and the alveoli and the nasal passages. And these are the ones that we think, here's a little coronavirus here attached to a receptor. These are the ones that we think are having the immediate effects. But equally, it's now becoming more apparent that some of the people with COVID-19 symptoms are actually having a lot of gut symptoms as well. And we know the gut is very important in terms of our immune regulation. So directly under the epithelial cells or the lining cells of the gut are these immune cells, and over here in the respiratory system, almost a similar type of pattern. What's really key here, and this is a lot of the message that we've been conveying in this series, is that there are cellular switches within cells, and when those switches get activated, they turn on a whole host of defensive processes. So in this case here, when we turn on a particular switch, it activates cell protective defensive mechanisms all over the body, not just here where we're describing. Every cell of the body can have these protective mechanisms activated. And among the 200 or more genes that are switched on, there are those that code for antioxidant defenses, anti-inflammatory modulation, how the cell produces its own energy to keep doing the things it needs to do, how it detoxifies or spring cleans the waste products within the cell. And very importantly, this same defense mechanism enables our cells, both here in the respiratory cells and in the gut, to produce antimicrobial compounds, which do specifically kill a whole range of different bugs. So what we know is that we can activate these cellular switches a lot by what we choose to eat or don't eat. So this kind of food is activating all of these protective mechanisms, and junk food over processed food actually does not activate them, and it actually increases the inflammatory processes. And then it's not all about food. Then another area we can influence these protective actions is by exercise and rest, and all of the good lifestyle practices we all know about. But also we can have environmental factors like radiation, which can have an inflammatory effect on the cells. So there are many ways that human cells can take care of themselves, but it's this subtle switching on protective genes and switching on inflammatory genes that makes the big difference in how we deal with these things. And specifically where coronavirus is involved, we saw this in episode 1, where here's the little spikes on the coronavirus attaching to the ACE2 receptor. So that's specifically what these spikes attach to. And the ACE2 receptor is in virtually every cell in the body. And these are highly protective molecules, except when they get chopped up into little pieces by the virus, we lose that protection. But the key thing I want to reinforce here is just by that spike attaching to the receptor does not give you an infection. It does not give you COVID-19 as an infectious disease. It needs a little assistant over here, this protease enzyme. And what that protease enzyme does is it enables the virus membrane to virtually morph into the membrane of the cell, and that's how the virus gets in. So that's a pretty important part of the process. And here's where it really gets interesting, because our own healthy cells make protease inhibitors. So we can actually block that action from happening. So we can block this little assistant over here, and that at the outset can stop the entry of the virus. And that enzyme here has this anti-protease here that blocks that function. It's activated by the same cellular switch, which we're going to talk about, that activates all of these other protective mechanisms. And that's been published fairly recently. And a molecule called sulforaphane, which is very high in broccoli sprouts, is the thing that switches that on and now blocks the entry of the virus, because it stops this protease here from assisting the virus to get into the cells.
I know when you first introduced that, Christine, because you're a champion in sulforaphane. I mean, that's what you've done, was the topic of your PhD, and you're really a world expert on that. And, I know, so you're going to talk about that in relation to NRF2, it's switching on NRF2. And there are all sorts of claims being made out there in commercial, product land about NRF2. But really the papers, the studies, are all, in favour of the sulforaphane being the most powerful, the most potent activator of the release of NRF2. So tell us a little bit more. But if I can just go back to that, anti-protease mechanism, every time we'd sort of uncover a new NRF2 activated and sulforaphane, therefore sulforaphane activated mechanism in the body, it's just so delightfully, like an orchestra, as we call it, where they're interplaying to provide every possible defense mechanism to help the cell and the body to survive and be in health. So sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder
That's
there.
all right, yeah. And look, you call me an expert in sulforaphane, but I didn't know any of that in relation to that anti-protease that's activated through NRF2 until the last 3 or 4 months when I've been delving into COVID-19 research. So it is fascinating that there's another inbuilt mechanism that nature has provided. So I talked just before about sulforaphane being the most potent naturally occurring activator, but really there's a whole host of foods. Here's just an example of foods, but I could basically take the whole fruit and vegetable range of foods available anywhere in the world, and they will all have, to some degree, some NRF2 activating capacity. But it so happens that sulforaphane is just light years ahead of anything else, and it's very useful now from a medicinal point of view because it's doing so much more than all these other vegetables. That said, if you eat a diet that's very rich in a whole variety of different fruits and vegetables and large quantities of them, you will activate NRF2. That's how humans have survived on this planet for eons, eating the available foods, getting fresh air and sunshine and exercise and all those very basic lifestyle factors. But the thing that gets missed out in many of these discussions is the need to eat whole, unrefined foods. So let me just continue there. So here we are looking at the NRF2. I call it a switch. It's a protein molecule. And what these foods are doing, they all have specific molecules that activate NRF2. And when you switch on NRF2, what you do then is you send signals to the DNA, and then that DNA now produces hundreds and hundreds of protective enzymes. And the NRF2 mechanism is governing several hundred genes associated with cell defense. So it's really a very valuable key to how the function of any cell in the body is working, not just those associated with immunity, all cells.
Yeah, so can you give us a look at some of the specific areas where it's working in relation to, you say, against the viral infection and in this instance we're talking about COVID-19.
All right, so we just talk in a general sense about it's a potent activator of cellular defenses. It's activating cellular antioxidant and detox enzymes. This is really important because so many people go out shopping looking for antioxidant supplements. You don't need to buy an antioxidant supplement. What you need to do is switch on your own cell's ability to produce them. So when you're switching on your antioxidant enzymes, you're switching on your detox enzymes. And when you're doing that, you're also enhancing your anti-inflammatory defenses. There's the SLPI protease enzyme that is inhibited. So that's the new thing that we've learnt this year. We switch on the epithelial production of antimicrobials like beta defensin, and these little guys are powerful. They kill bugs in the system. They're just like an antibiotic, but the advantage is antibiotics will wipe out all the, let's say, bacteria in the gut. Beta defensin knows the good guys and it knows the bad guys. So it's killing the pathogens and it's leaving the protective commensal microbes, the probiotic species, completely untouched, so they go on doing what they need to do. That's remarkable. We have no drug available in any way that can just kill the pathogens and leave the good bugs alone. This is remarkable, and we can enhance this system by activating the right switches. And then the other thing that's really very important in the context of viral protection is that it coordinates the action of NRF2, this protective switch, and immune activating signaling molecules. And we'll come on to what that means in a moment.
Yeah, look, I know too, when looking at that in the past as a clinician, I prescribed lots of antioxidant supplements, you know, and but I knew that what the body could produce. I knew about superoxide dismutase and what the body could produce. was just outweighed, significantly. But I didn't realise how much better what the body, produces as those synthetic vitamins and so on, until I found out a little bit more and learned a bit more about nutrigenomics. And it's just astounding, the body just does it so well. And the same with these antimicrobials, these beta defensins and so on. They spare our commensals and knock out all the other guys. I mean, who could put it together better? It's really it's fantastic. Yeah. Well, once again, as a clinician in the past too, Christine, I used antimicrobial herbs, and not fully understanding that the body had a much better system in place. So can you show us a little bit more what's happening in that area?
Before I do, this little molecule up here, this is a sulforaphane molecule, and just look at the shape of it. It's if you're not a chemist, it won't mean much, but just look at the shape of it. It's a sort of a zigzaggy line with a few bits and pieces, and that'll become relevant in a moment. So if we just look at this figure here, well, the one on the left that's blanked out is blanked out for a reason, because we'll come to that later. But here again, we've got here, this is the intestinal epithelium and its underlying immune network. And here's our sulforaphane. So what it's doing, because it's the most potent activator of cell defenses, these epithelial cells here, they all have these little NRF2 switches in them. So when the sulforaphane molecules are present, that's activating that switch. As we talked about before, we're switching on the antimicrobial defenses. These things can kill viruses. As long as the virus is sort of here, still in the lining or in the tube of the gut, they can kill from here. And they have a number of other functions as well, which we won't go into. So being able to activate this mechanism is a very, very powerful defense. And then we talked before about activating all these other processes. And when you get all that happening at the same time, you have step one of a very powerful defense system that's happening here. And we should talk about step two, I guess, then.
Yeah, with that too, can I just say, so this is happening both in the gut and in the lung too, these mechanisms?
It's happening in all the tubes of the body.
Okay, so the urinary tract?
It's happening in the urinary tract and in the reproductive tract. So all of the tubes, where they have some contact with microbes from the outside, we have to have a way to be sure that these microbes don't get in. We don't want them getting into these cells and down into our immune network. Occasionally they do, and sometimes there are little gaps in these cells which are brought on by inflammatory states and other things, and some of the bugs can sneak in. So just as we've got this protective process going on out here, we have a whole complex of other protective processes going on in this underlying immune network. Many layers of defense that are going on here, active at all times, provided the cell is able to recognize the threat and react accordingly. And that's where generally health is so important.
Yeah, so stepping this up would even help, say, if someone had recurrent urinary tract infections or
any sort of infectious organism. These are the mechanisms built into every cell in the body to address those. So very, very important core mechanism that's active in all cells, particularly active in the liver, which is a major organ of detoxification. So you can see here, enhanced detoxification is one of the essential processes. And if the cell is out killing lots of microbes, pathogens that shouldn't be there, there's a lot of debris floating around in the cells. So being able to switch on your detoxification at the same time that you're killing bugs is very important. You've got to do your housekeeping at the same time as you're living in the house, and it's a little bit like that here.
Yeah, particularly if you've got the scraps going on in the neighbourhood. Yeah, so Christine, in the digestive tract, we hear a lot today about probiotics and the role of probiotics. So what is some of the mechanisms there and their involvement with immune system.
Yes, so that's the other part of the equation, which we'll come to in a moment, because some of these organisms here, like this little purple one and this orange one, they could be a lactobacillus organism. So they're what I'm calling the good guys. They're the commensal organisms. They live happily in association with our cells, and they in fact turn out to be absolutely essential, which is the problem when you have antibiotics, because you're not just killing the pathogen, you're killing some of these commensals as well. What's interesting about probiotics is, you know, a lot of people take probiotic supplements, or they might eat yogurt or sauerkraut or those sorts of fermented foods to get the probiotic organisms into the system. But what's been discovered over the last decade or so is these things can be dead or alive. And so for a long time we thought probiotics work because we thought you put in your yogurt bacteria, let's say, and that was then going to grow inside your digestive system and push out the bad bugs and the pathogens. Well, it's sort of correct, but not entirely. And what I mean by that is, when we take these organisms into the system, they don't actually take up residence there, except for very few cases. They do some good on the way through the system, and that's of great benefit, which we'll mention shortly, but they don't take up residence there. So they don't push the bad bugs out of the way. So if you have an antibiotic and it's killing off the lactobacillus or the bifidobacteria, the two commonest ones, you don't replace them by putting those bacteria in there. You replace them by feeding your cells, feeding your microbiota as well as your own cells the right foods, and then they will grow of their own accord. So what's interesting about the fact that you can take them dead or alive is there's special molecules on the walls of these bacteria called lipoteichoic acid is one example, which we'll just call LTA, and we'll come to that in a moment, and I'll show you. So here's Lactobacillus plantarum. Now plantarum as in plant, and if you eat sauerkraut or kimchi, this is a very prolific microbe living on the surface. So it's a lactobacillus that lives on plants, as why it's sort of part of the sauerkraut and the kimchi story. But nevertheless, there's a particular strain being bred in Japan that has it's called an HKL, which is heat-killed Lactobacillus 137 strain. So that's a particular strain which has generous amounts of this LTA molecule on its surface. And this HKL 137 strain has been standardized to yield a certain amount of LTA. Now, LTA is there because that's a molecule that our own immune system can recognize. So what happens is, so here's the HKL microbe, here's the LTA on its surface, and our cells have things called toll-like receptors just lining all over the place on the surfaces of membranes. And this one, in this case, is called toll-like receptor 2. So when LTA attaches to TLR2, it then activates an innate immune response. So innate immune responses are just those built-in immune responses we all have. And this macrophage, which is a key immune cell, picks up that signal. And what it does then is it produces this thing called IL-12, which doesn't matter what its name is, but it is now activating another lot of switches, and these activate multiple antimicrobial and virus kill mechanisms. You've probably heard of natural killer cells and cytotoxic cells. They come from this mechanism here. Now, this is part of the very clever internal signaling and fine-tuning that our own immune systems have. So while we're off killing the thing that we don't want to be there, at the same time, IL-12 can switch on other mechanisms that say to the cell, now just don't overdo this here, you need to produce some inflammatory cytokines to kill these bugs, but just don't overdo it. So it's like it's got its foot on the accelerator here and it's touching the brake over here. Don't go too far. The other thing IL-12 does, it makes sure we don't get an allergic response happening at the same time, because all these pathogens that are breaking down their waste material and producing this cellular debris could very easily have an allergic response on a susceptible person. And so really then the next stage of all of this is the cells recognise it's time to shut this down. We've got rid of the bugs that we didn't want here. We just shut the whole thing down, and now the body goes into repair mechanism. It's just absolutely beautiful in its intricacies, and the fine tuning never ceases to amaze me. And, you know, we try to sometimes go into the system with a sledgehammer to belt away at a particular bug. You know, we use antibiotics like sledgehammers to just kill every bacterium that's in the cell. We don't need to do that. We need to activate these inbuilt mechanisms, and nature will take care of that for us.
Phenomenal, isn't it? And that, you know, uncontrolled inflammation, that's part of what they're calling the cytokine storm too, isn't it?
Yes, so in those people where the disease just really gets out of control and they end up in the ICU and they're on ventilation and so on, this cytokine storm is just another way of saying the inflammation is uncontrolled. Either the load of virus they got was just so totally overwhelming that their immune system couldn't deal with it, or it was an average load, but their immune system wasn't in good enough shape to kick into gear with all of these steps.
Because a lot of people's bodies are in that have really high levels of low-grade chronic inflammation. I guess it sets them up either for you know, chronic cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all these really chronic ailments. But I guess if it's there already, and then something like this really severe comes in, then it means they're not in the right, the immune system isn't balanced in the right way to be able to switch it off.
Absolutely correct, yes, because what's been discovered is some of those people at greatest risk of getting COVID-19 complications are those who do have that cardiovascular and metabolic imbalance already. So they already have a low level of chronic inflammation going on in the cells. And then when they have to deal with the virus, it's just overloading it completely. And interestingly too, since you mentioned that, dealing with cardiometabolic disease, from my clinical perspective, we use this process as part of dealing with that. And you'd be going, really? What's the immune system got to do with cardiac or cardiovascular and diabetic type diseases? Well, it's a long story for another day, but yes, it most certainly does.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? So it's a sort of like a long, slow road to decay. But if a crisis comes along, those that are on that road are less able to respond. And if we take the other road, which, you know, through good diet, lifestyle, sulforaphane, those sorts of things, we actually prime our body to respond in health rather than go to that disease path. So Christine, back to that cytokine storm. I know there's been a bit of press on different nutrients to help that, and single nutrients. Quercetin's one of them. Can you talk to us a little bit about that in relation to that, please?
Yes, so in the process of trying to find anti-inflammatory natural compounds to deal with this uncontrolled inflammation and the cytokine storm, there's been lots of suggestions. So there's lots of people suggesting the vitamins, which we'll come to a little later on. But there are molecules like quercetin. I've seen a few people looking at quercetin, and I believe there's a clinical trial going on at the moment with vitamin C and quercetin being used in COVID cases. I don't know how far down the track they are with it, but there's no data yet. But the thing about quercetin is you can buy it as a supplement, in a tablet or a capsule, but this is where it really comes from. It's a food molecule. And I've just put up some of the highest sources of quercetin that you can find in food. So these are all examples. Interesting.
So Christine, if I may, how in a serve, what would be a serve of capers? I'm going to start on it pretty soon.
Well, normally they're just an accompaniment to like a soft cheese or something like that, aren't they? Because they're probably just a couple of tablespoons or a couple of dessert spoons. They're not all that popular, but of course, as you say, now having a look at capers sitting up the top of the list, why not? No reason not to. Here they are up here. But really, I think you could look at that and go, oh, well, look, this one's the best. But the truth is, and there's a much longer list than this, I just put what would fit on the screen, and I got it from this resource here, cuisine.com. So if you want to look at the complete list, there it is. But by eating a wide variety of plant foods, you're going to get lots and lots of these things from here. But the question, I think, is not so much where will I get my quercetin from, which is also in tea, by the way, drinking tea, black and green. It's more about how effective is quercetin in addressing these cell defense processes. And the one we've harped on a fair bit is the NRF2 activation. And I think we put this into a different context when we start to look at how effective it is in the overall scheme of things, knowing that activating NRF2 reduces inflammation. What does quercetin do?
So, Christine, you actually published an article. I'm just looking up and reading that at the moment. It's sulforaphane, it's coming of age as a clinically irrelevant nutraceutical in the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. And that was published at the end of last year. And you did a comparison there into...
Yes, so what we did is we looked, we're looking at cellular defences, and we're looking at the ability of NRF2 to activate cell defences and comparing different food compounds with that. So before we look at the comparison, I still need to reinforce the fact that if the wider the variety of plant compounds we consume, the greater our ability to upregulate these defences. So I'm just going to compare sulforaphane with quercetin. Now, I asked you to look before at the little zigzaggy molecule called sulforaphane, and now we look at quercetin, which has got these little hexagons, and that's a big and bulky molecule. And that's important, as it is for turmeric here, same sort of structure, is that sulforaphane will glide easily into the cells through the membranes, whereas these big, bulky molecules are very hard to squeeze their way in. But when you look at their NRF2 activating ability, so here's a whole host of common supplements. Here's resveratrol, silymarin, chlorophyll, different things that people take, beta-carotene. Here's curcumin, which is the turmeric molecule, which is generally regarded across the world of clinicians as being a potent anti-inflammatory molecule. There's quercetin, the little green one there, and here's sulforaphane. So it's like comparing chalk and cheese in terms of the ability to activate the NRF2 defences. So I think that puts a somewhat different light on looking for NRF2 activation if you are looking for single potent molecules.
I guess, Christine, when you look at, say, the curcumin or the quercetin relative to, vitamin C or B12 or chlorophyll, those others, you'd be going, oh, great. But then it's like, what was that wonderful racehorse, the Australian racehorse that didn't lose a race? I mean, just miles in front of the field. So you also did in that paper, though, the absorption, a comparison on the absorption.
Yes,
talk about that
yeah,
earlier.
I'll talk about that. But before I do, let's just look at the fact that vitamin C is not on this list, and it's not on here because it doesn't do this, and yet it's one of the popular supplements. Nor is beta-carotene has minimal effect. And that's the vitamin A that, some people take. So, and resveratrol is a very popular supplement. It is rating here, but it's so small it doesn't make any difference. And indole-3-carbinol and diindolylmethane, methane, which people who are looking for broccoli supplements will often take, but they're not doing any of the things that the sulforaphane does. So sulforaphane is highest in the broccoli sprouts, whereas I3C and DIM are highest in the broccoli vegetable, although still minimal. But let me get to your point on bioavailability. This graph is out of the same paper that I published last year. And so bioavailability is just meaning what percentage of a compound that I swallow ends up getting into my cells. So there's the sulforaphane there, roughly 80%. That's based on a number of different conditions. So we take this fairly loosely, but under similar conditions, 4% of curcumin gets into the of quercetin gets into the cells, and 1% of curcumin. So the sulforaphane's got two things going for it. It's the most potent naturally occurring NRF2 activator, but it's also highly bioavailable. So most of what you consume gets into the cells. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's very good. So there are other specific nutrients, single nutrients that are being, promoted at the moment too, for general immune and for COVID-19 as well. Can you maybe cover a little bit off on those?
Yeah. What's very popular, as I'm sure everyone's seen, is vitamin C is being touted as, being absolutely essential, usually in very high doses. It's a synthetic molecule. It's never seen an orange or anything of that kind in its life. Some old science done 40 years ago was done on intravenous vitamin C, where you can get it straight into the bloodstream readily at fairly high doses. So we're not talking about that. That has to be done in a hospital environment. You can't do it yourself. There is some preliminary evidence that high dose intravenous vitamin C might be helpful in a crisis environment. But for what most people are doing, they're just taking the oral supplement. Most vitamin C is actually made in a factory out of corn. And it's really based on very old science, because when the vitamin C story evolved, there was no knowledge of nutrigenomics. The term nutrigenomics was coined about October 2004, which is relatively recently, 16 years ago. And it's from our understanding of nutrigenomics that we learned that there are so many more other molecules in plant food aside from the vitamins and minerals that are really having a huge difference. And it's these other molecules that are switching on the defenses. So here's just an example of vitamin A in food. So these are largely beta-carotene in the plant foods and vitamin A in the animal food. So that's liver, fish and cheese, and then a whole host of other, and there's eggs, and then other beta-carotene named after carrots are available here. So they're all absolutely essential nutrients, but I would challenge the idea that as a single supplement there's much use, because when you eat spinach or broccoli or liver or any of these foods here, it's not just about vitamin A. There's hundreds of chemicals in there, a large number of which we've identified, but many more we don't know very much about at this stage. It's a whole research area that's just evolving. I mean, that's probably cranberries, I think, in there. So we have all sorts of opportunities to get these nutrients just by eating good food. We don't have to drown ourselves in vitamin supplements. And then vitamin C, well, it's as easy to get vitamin C. You really only have to have a couple of pieces a day of fruit or some of the vegetables which are rich in vitamin C. I mean, there's an orange there, about 70, 80 milligrams or something like that. For you to get a couple of 100 milligrams of vitamin C a day is not very difficult. Now, the proponents of the vitamin C theories would say, look, we need hundreds and thousands of milligrams of vitamin C a day. That's part of the old narrative. And we since learned that really you can only absorb about 400 milligrams of vitamin C a day anyhow in a healthy person, and probably a little more in someone who's unwell. But the real answer to this is the vitamin C is not driving the immune mechanisms that are built into our cells. They're an important part of the immune system, and all of the immune cells, the neutrophils and the macrophages and so on that make up our immune defenses, all require vitamin C at proportionately higher amounts than other cells of the body, but they don't drive that mechanism. And I think that's an important point to really remember. The other nutrient that's become very popular in recent discussions is vitamin D. Vitamin D is probably misnamed as a vitamin. It's really considered to be more of a hormone. So it comes from animal foods. Sardines is a good example. Fish is a good example. The good thing about a sardine in a can is you are actually eating the whole fish. So you're getting little bits of liver and little bits of kidney and all of those organs within the sardine, which are highly nutritious in many other compounds.
Plus all those really soft little bones, Christine.
Yeah, and you get the calcium as
well.
Yeah. And of course, sunshine. So if you didn't eat any of these foods and you got enough sunshine and you had otherwise a healthy diet, you will make your own vitamin D. The trouble is, in some parts of the world and some times of the year, we don't get exposed to enough sun. And if we're working in an office for many hours a day, we often don't get it either. But that's fine because we can get it out of these foods. Now, you might wonder why there are mushrooms sitting in this photograph, because mushrooms have also been promoted as a source of vitamin D, and I can't pass by without explaining the issue here. And the issue is there is a preformed vitamin D in mushrooms, which is not the active form that does the work. So it's vitamin D3 that does the work in our cells, and it's vitamin D, which is in D2, which is in the mushrooms. So that's an important consideration, particularly for those people who prefer to eat a plant-only diet. You have to be very careful then that you're getting plenty of sunshine or you're going to miss out. But vitamin D, as I said, has emerged as being a great influencer of many signalling processes in cells. We probably haven't yet done enough research to know exactly how it impacts the immune system. But there have been some recent surveys done that have shown that those people with the lowest blood levels of vitamin D are the ones who are more likely to get a serious adverse reaction from the COVID-19 or the COVID-2 virus. So pretty important, even though we don't fully understand the mechanism, there are plenty of other good reasons for us to be eating these sorts of foods several times a week and preferably daily. So we can't let the vitamin D story go unmentioned. But I still need to caution this concept of now running out and buying a vitamin D supplement and taking that. It makes no sense to me to take a single isolated nutrient or even several of them, because there are hundreds of compounds in foods and none of us knows exactly which one our cell needs at any particular time of any day of the week. So it takes the thinking out of it just to say, all right, I can eat these foods, I can eat a wide range of these, I can eat a wide range of all the plant foods that we discussed earlier. So that's how the immune system is really just responding to the tools of nature. Food, sunshine, fresh air, exercise are all the tools of nature, and we need to take advantage of them. And that means pushing the junk food out of the way, especially at a time like this, because not only can we not get these essential nutrients by eating junk food, which are largely devoid, but we are also then promoting a pro-inflammatory response. So for anyone who's fearful of catching this virus and getting its worst effects, you need to stop the junk food because it's pro-inflammatory and you don't want to catch the virus already with a pro-inflammatory status in your body.
Yeah, poor pity for the folk who are living in the towers in Melbourne that are being, given sausage rolls for 2 days. Oh, it's terrible, shocking. That's another story.
Yes.
But it's interesting, the vitamin D, it actually adds to the conversation in relation to sulforaphane and NRF2, because sulforaphane and NRF2, one of the targets is the vitamin D receptor genes. And the many cases where we've seen people that don't respond, start with low doses of D, don't respond to the high supplements, but when they're put onto a high sulforaphane yielding supplement, their vitamin D levels start to go up. So it's once again the mechanisms that actually make these things work in the body that is so important. So Christine, I guess just in closing, we've looked at cell defences, and in particular through the sulforaphane and the NRF2, and then we've looked at the probiotic story there too. And it's interesting because when you see, talking about the heat killed, I remember decades ago when I was starting off in clinical practice and being mentored by an integrative doctor who'd been around for many years. At the time, having a conversation, he said, "Robert, doesn't matter if they're dead or alive, they're going to do some good." And I had no idea of this research that came out, 2-3 decades later, actually proving how that works. So can we just do a bit of a recap as we're coming to the end here on those mechanisms and how they're working across and within the body?
Sure. Let me just follow up on a couple of things that you've just said. So the vitamin D receptor, how could I forget mentioning that? You would wonder what on earth broccoli sprouts would have to do with vitamin D, but the very fact that the sulforaphane from the broccoli sprouts activates NRF2, and then NRF2 is upregulating several of the vitamin D receptors. And so now the vitamin D floating around has got somewhere to go. So that's been quite a revelation that's not well known. It's only appeared in the last 5 or 6 years. So there's a valuable piece of knowledge, and how these foods are all integrating with each other in a mixed diet. And this concept of the dead probiotic, which is pretty interesting. The other thing I wanted to say earlier with the probiotics is the healthy person has roughly 700 to 1,000 different probiotic organisms living in their digestive tracts. That's a lot. And then when you have an antibiotic, which may be considered essential for whatever reason, you will wipe out large proportions of that 700 or so commensal species in there. Then when you go to the pharmacy or the health food store and you buy a probiotic supplement, which might have 1, 2, up to a dozen different species in it, it's not possible to think that you're going to put back all of the ones that were taken out. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that occurs, that when you take a probiotic supplement after you've had antibiotics, you're going to fix it all back up again. You don't. What's fixing it all back up again, as I said earlier, is to feed the bugs that are remaining. They won't all be killed. There'll be enough there. Feed them what they want and they'll grow back again. And it's really the fibres in food which play a very large role in feeding those organisms. And the other family are the polyphenols, which are the big bulky molecules we showed earlier that come out of things like green tea and red wine and raspberries and beetroot and a whole host of different plant foods. So that's what's feeding the microbes rather than a supplement. But let me move on then. We've just killed our mushrooms here because they're not a source of vitamin D. And we'll just sum up some of the things that we've talked about. So the lifestyle factors here: sun, exercise, sleep, and the moon. So and that's
puppy dogs I see there as well.
Puppy dog. And the puppy dog's there for 2 reasons. Yes, because, you know, we need a restful sleep. And if you need to take a live teddy bear, even as a grown-up man, you can do that. But more importantly, a lot of our microbiome is being fed by close association with our companion animals in the home. And your little doggy that goes and digs out in the garden has his own little colony of microbes, and he brings some of those in and he snuggles up with you and you share some of those microbes. So we used to think these were germs and quickly wash your hands, disinfect, use sanitizer, whatever you have to do. But what you're actually doing is you're losing opportunities for your own microbiome to become more diverse. So let's just have a look at what we've said overall. So first of all, it's pretty clear, and I think I've probably hammered this enough, that we need to eat a balanced diet. We need to have plenty of plant foods in there. And when I'm teaching clinicians the GEM protocol, one of the things I insist on is that we look at 600 grams of non-starchy vegetables daily. And that's much more than most people consume, but that's enough to give us a decent helping hand on sending signals to our cells to enhance their defences. And no junk food, or only very occasionally. Here's our respiratory epithelium, and here are the little cilia that are attached to the surface and flush mucus and unwanted debris out of the system. So we're using that to activate our cell defences, not just in the gut, but also the lungs and really all tissues that have tubes that lead to the outside where we can get microbial involvement. Sulforaphane, so we can add specific concentrates as supplements. So sulforaphane is available, or a broccoli sprout which yields sulforaphane is available. There's actually no sulforaphane in the supplement. The broccoli material has to be produced in a way that it retains this myrosinase enzyme, and if it contains that enzyme, you will produce sulforaphane when you swallow it, and there are lots of tables of the doses that are required to achieve certain outcomes. And then the other thing is the heat-killed Lactobacillus 137 powder or capsules are available, and those are for people who really want to increase their intake of those specific signalling molecules. Also, if you're not inclined to take the HKL as a supplement, make your own kefir, make your own sauerkraut, make your own kimchi. Those fermented foods are very rich sources of a whole range of different probiotic species. And where you might only get half a dozen or so species out of a pretty expensive probiotic capsule, by making your own products at home, particularly kefir, you can get up to 50 or 60 different species out of your kefir, and if you make it at home every day, it's constantly changing. It'll, in different seasons and different conditions in your kitchen, it'll grow more or less of different organisms. So that's one of nature's little secrets. And I mean, people have been doing that since time immemorial. We had no refrigeration once, and we had difficulty knowing how to preserve food. So making your own fermented foods has always been a traditional skill in the kitchen until fairly recent times, when we tend not to do that. You don't get that many organisms out of commercial yogurt. So there it is again, we're talking about the microbiome and the different types of organisms, and that's directly having conversations with our epithelial cells and with our underlying immune cells. So it's very, very important from our standpoint that we're dealing with the epithelial cells like these, and we're also dealing with the microbiome. And when you get all that functioning as it should, it's a good opportunity that good cellular health will follow. Now, the last one I haven't mentioned before, but this is a really nice grandma's type remedy that's got some science attached to it now. So if you feel the first signs of the scratchy throat or anything to tell you that you've got something immune related going on that you prefer wasn't there, make yourself some very strong ginger tea, not tea bags, you have to make it yourself. You get a piece of ginger about the size of an adult thumb, which is a fair bit, grate it up or put it in the blender, and get half of the whole lemon, whiz that all up in the blender, pour boiling water over it and let it sit there for 5 or 10 minutes, strain it off, put a bit of honey in it if you like, and sip that. You will be surprised how much better you start to feel very soon. Ginger is a very powerful anti-inflammatory compound in its own right. Citrus fruit contain all sorts of molecules, aside from the vitamin C, which I don't think is really the functional point here. The skin on citrus fruits, whether it's lemon, orange, or wherever, contains very valuable polyphenolic molecules which have very beneficial effects throughout the system. So that's a good little home remedy. You take about, say, 2 large coffee mugs about an hour apart when you feel the symptoms. Try it and see. It's very calming and can't do you any harm, relatively cheap and relatively available. And so that pretty much sums up the self-help ideas that we can put into practice. And if we do manage to encounter the virus, which I think we're probably all going to do at some stage or other, we can't remain locked down forever. I believe we will certainly reduce the likelihood of seriousness or serious symptoms that come about if we do catch the virus, because this is a system that we can use not just for coronavirus, but for just general immune health. So whether it's the winter colds and flus, or, you know, anything else that's happening in the body, sores that won't heal, all these strategies are beneficial in simply just giving Mother Nature a helping hand to let her own inbuilt defences do what they're intended to do.
Fantastic, Christine. Thank you for that, and for the 2 earlier sessions too. And for anyone that hasn't seen those, if you go to www.celllogic.com.au/learning centre, and then you'll find it in there. You'll be able to have a look at this one and the other 2. And as Christine mentioned, you know, this isn't just about COVID-19. It's about treating a host of or conditions of immunity, helping with the immune system, but it also will help to prevent the development of chronic disease as well. And I love your approach, Christine, of food first. And yeah, I mean, as you say, we're feeding not just ourselves, but the bugs inside. And we might as well all be happy at the same time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Robert, and we'll talk again soon.
Likewise. Bye-bye.